All right. Hello, everybody. Ethos Publications is going to do a interview with Jenna Robinson. She has incredible credentials in the field of higher education. So, Jenna, thank you so much for being willing to do this interview with us. And if you wouldn't mind, just give our viewers and our clients a little overview of your expertise and what you do and what your association does.
Hi, well, I'm the president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal, and we work on trying to reform higher education from a free market perspective. We have a couple of different things that we're very interested in. First, we're interested in intellectual diversity, which means making our campuses good places to create free and flourishing minds, which is what liberal education used to be about, and we want to bring that back. We want to, of course, as part of that, bring free speech back to campus. And so we work on those kinds of issues quite frequently. We also want to make sure that universities offer quality academic choices and have high academic standards so that students are learning things that are valuable to them as people and valuable in the marketplace. We are a watchdog for the taxpayers. We're interested in good, transparent, and responsible governance. And lastly, as I said, we come at this from a free market perspective. So we are more interested in students gaining knowledge than in universities themselves. So we like apprenticeships, we like code academies, we like independent learning, any kind of learning that can take a young person and add to their human capital to make them more ready for their lives and the market. All of that to us is valuable education. It's not just getting a bachelor's degree.
Perfect. I love to hear that personally. That was the type of education that many of our clients have been brought up with, myself included. So I definitely like to hear that there's someone out there on the side of people who actually care about learning about real knowledge and truth. So let's start with the free market. So debaters this year have been faced with the resolution that the United States, it doesn't clarify government or society yet, though final wording is still in the process, that the United States should reform its policies on higher education. So, and obviously the free market is incredibly impacted, not just by the graduates, but also by the economics of higher education itself. So let's talk about the market value of education and whether or not you think the free market is being positively affected, negatively affected, what changes we could see in that area. We would just love to hear your thoughts on that.
So I think that the biggest problem right now is that degrees, especially the bachelor's degree, they're a signal, right? They're a signal to the market that a person can be educated, is smart, shows up on time, is dedicated, and all these other things. And when a bachelor's degree was rare, it was a really valuable signal because it was hard to get. And so the people who did get bachelor's degrees, that degree showed their bona fides. But now that the bachelor's degree is easier to get, now that, almost 70% of high school students go on to some kind of higher education, there are a lot of students who have simply kind of coasted through in their undergraduate education. They've gotten that bachelor's degree, and so it's not the signal that it used to be. Students on average still get, graduates with bachelor's degrees still get paid more on average than people without degrees. But the signaling mechanism of that bachelor's degree it's kind of falling apart. And that's a problem that employers are trying to grapple with, and that universities and students are all trying to grapple with at the same time. And so we're concerned about, what is the best way to make sure that students can let employers know that they have value in the marketplace. And of course, making sure that the students who do get a bachelor's degree are getting bang for their buck. Nobody wants to come out of their undergraduate education worse off financially than they started out. They want to be able to pay back whatever loans that they take out and get a job that's going to allow them to, live a comfortable life.
So many students are coming out of college with hundreds and thousands of dollars worth of debt. And personally, many of my friends are graduating, with great educations, very high quality, but they're already at a disadvantage, right? So I know many students within this resolution are interested in debating methods to lower the cost of higher education, and many of them have explored efforts like, eliminating like some of the federal grant systems, so people are more encouraged to work. And what do you think about all those initiatives? What would you suggest?
So I think there are a couple things that can be done. And I actually did debate myself in high school, and so I know that sometimes you get proposals that would never happen because you get to say, well, we're just going to debate that this happens. We don't have to actually get it through Congress. So with that said, I'm going to suggest some things that I don't think actually Congress would do, but that I think would make great resolutions for debate. The first thing I think that is worth talking about is ending federal student loans entirely. And there are a couple of things that I think would come about from that. First, there would still be loans available. They would be private instead of federal. And so, first off, that would be good for the taxpayers because they wouldn't be on the hook for paying loans that couldn't be paid off anymore. But what would also happen is that private lenders are going to be more careful about who they lend to than the federal government. Of course, the federal government doesn't look at credit scores. It doesn't look at your grades. It doesn't look at anything. All it looks at is, are you going to an accredited university? And so if we ended all government student loans, I think that we would see some effects, and some of the effects wouldn't come on until quite a ways down the road. But one of the things that has been, people have been talking about it for 30 years, but we're finally starting to see some evidence, and that is, so Bill Bennett, he was the Secretary of Education 30 years ago. He said, every time you increase the funding available for students to go to college, universities just jack up tuition. And, we're 30 years into his hypothesis now, and it looks like, yeah, there's something in that. It's not a one-to-one. You don't give $1,000 in aid and then they jack up their prices $1,000. But there is a relationship that we're starting to see. So down the line, if you ended federal student loans, we think that tuition would eventually come down because there would be less money in that big pot for colleges to gobble up. And another part of that, I think another proposal could be to make student loans subject to bankruptcy protection again. They were before 1995, so that if you graduated from college and you had some kind of hardship and you went bankrupt for whatever reason, you could discharge your student loans in bankruptcy. Since 1995, both federal and private loans it's not been legal to discharge them in bankruptcy. So even if you lose everything else, you discharge everything else in bankruptcy, you still are on the hook for those student loans. So if you change the policy back, it would make private lenders even more careful about who they gave loans to. They would start asking questions like, well, what are you going to major in? Are you going to a good program, not just an accredited program, but a program that actually teaches you skills that you can use in the future? And so I think that, those are two reforms that would make our market work a lot better for student lending.
Definitely. And I think, especially when you talked about lenders not looking at credit scores, not looking at what you're going to major in, the type of university you're going to, except for accreditation, it's incredibly shocking to realize that students are graduating. And I personally have friends, I'm still in college. I personally have friends that graduate, don't have any credit score whatsoever. They've never used credit, and yet there's still hundreds of thousands of dollars within their in debt, right? So that's extremely shocking, especially when you think about the way that the loan system normally works, and it's completely outside of the frame of rationale there.
No accountability.
Yeah, exactly. That line of reasoning is not seen anywhere else in society. And I know a lot of kids are worried about making the cost of college lower without necessarily having to access federal loans. So for students who are looking for reforms to lower the price of college, and their answer wasn't, increase the access of federal loans, what would you say to them?
I would say to them that those things are going to be changed at a much lower level. The federal government isn't going to be the actor that makes college affordable. It's going to be universities themselves reforming and innovating. And so we've seen that in some ways with some kind of alternative institutions. So Western Governors University is an example of that. They have got a kind of a mastery-based program, so you can take classes as fast as you can pass them, and they do it all online. You have access to mentors and to people you can work with, but most of the actual classwork is done online. And so that's one type of reform that we've seen. And while it doesn't make universities, cheap, it makes them a lot less expensive. Other universities, of course, have tried different reforms. If you get out of, say, athletics, if you stop called country club amenities, universities can be a lot less expensive. And so we see that in really small ways with universities across the country. And I think that actually community colleges have a lot to teach us in terms of how to keep education inexpensive. Community colleges don't have dormitories. They generally don't have big student centers. They don't have athletics, and they don't have a lot of the student life things that many kids are after. But if you want to just go to class and you want to learn, community colleges have that model. And there's nothing to stop an institution that offers bachelor's degrees from just scraping away all of the unnecessary kind of bells and whistles that come with the degree and just focusing on education. And I do think that, as the market kind of churns and as we see, some of the effects of, a long series of problems in higher education, that there will be small colleges that start to seriously look at ways to cut costs. And I think that we'll see that first at the small private institutions.
It's great to know. And I like how you differentiated that some actors will be the federal government and others will be small private institutions. So, and let's explore that, because the resolution actually doesn't specify that it has to be the federal government, which is different because most do. So we are exploring what reforms need to take place on the federal level, state level, local level, even an individualized institutional level. Where do you think the majority of this change should take place?
So I think the major funder of public higher education is the states. It's more than $155 billion. Most states spend somewhere around 10% of their budgets on higher education institutions. And so I think that to get reform, states have to be a part of it. And there are a lot of things that they can do. They can change the way that they fund higher education. They can go to kind of more of a voucher system than it is right now, because a lot of states will fund the institutions rather than the students. And so, moving to a voucher system could be possible. They could also fund state institutions a little bit more based on performance than they do right now. A lot of states use an enrollment model, including North Carolina, where I'm from. So their incentive is just to get warm bodies in the door, which is a terrible incentive. So I think changing those incentives at the state level could do a lot to move the needle on, a lot of problems in higher education. But aside from kind of the good we could do by changing the way we fund higher education, there are other things that states can do to reform higher education to make it better, more intellectually diverse, and more welcoming for students. And I think that there are a couple of ways that states can do that. One is to reaffirm their commitment to free speech. And there are a couple of bills and model legislation around the country that have been passed that I think would be worth looking into for anyone talking about higher education reform. There are also ways to reform due process on campus. Due process is a huge problem on campus because students who are accused of kind of disciplinary problems, not the academic kind, not plagiarism, but if you're accused of sexual harassment on campus, which is defined down to be, almost anything these days, instead of going through the regular court system, you're going to go through a court system on your university's campus. And the due process afforded to students in those court systems is nothing like it is for a regular criminal court. The system really needs reform. We need to go back to those protections we have for due process. So I think that's another fruitful place to look for people looking to create reform on college campuses. And last, and I think that this might appeal to someone who has kind of gone through, you know, education that's outside of the traditional path or the conventional path, is that we need to protect freedom of association on college campuses. A lot of college campuses tell student groups that they can't choose their own leadership. They have to have what's called an all-comers policy, which essentially means that a religious student group on campus can't put in their constitution that religious students or students who share the views of the group have to be the leaders of the group. And so that has caused problems on campuses when the university essentially tells them that they have to accept someone into their group and even as a leadership position in their group who doesn't adhere to the values of the group. And so I think that there are policies to protect that freedom of association on campus as well. And so all three of those things I just mentioned are, of course, rights that we have enshrined in our Constitution, but universities have found ways to get around it. And it's the state governments that can kind of pull back and make sure that students get the same rights as all other Americans.
I love that you brought up the due process point. Especially, we have found in our research that is a problem on religious campuses more than any other campus or any other type of campus, which is extremely sad. Not necessarily a statement on religion or anything, but it is interesting to see that due process is ignored on a lot of campuses. Mm-hmm. So for these reforms, I know that you said the federal government has like these rights that apply to all Americans, and yet universities get around them. So are these private universities, state universities, both?
They're any university that accepts federal loan money, and some. I mean, most institutions accept federal loan money, but if they do accept that money, that means that they are subject to any of the rulings that come down from the Office of Civil Rights or the Department of Education. And so one thing that the Office of Civil Rights, which is part of the Department of Education, that something they've done recently is they've put forth this series of what they call Dear Colleague letters. And so they're guidance letters that tell universities or suggest to universities how they need to treat particular types of infractions on campus. And one particular letter, which it's infamous and kind of in the student rights community, it's like the Dear Colleague letter. It essentially tells campuses that they have to treat infractions on campus with a different burden of proof than in a criminal case. So instead of doing beyond a reasonable doubt, which is what you have to prove in a criminal case, the accuser or the prosecution in these on-campus cases only has to prove things that something is slightly more likely than not to have happened. And so if you think you're the jury on this, or you're the administrator on this who's going to decide punishment, you have to think, well, does that scenario seem like it's a little bit more plausible than not? Okay, well, in that case, that means that the person's guilty. If it's slightly more plausible than not, that's a guilty verdict on campus. Whereas if the same person was being tried in criminal court, if it's only, well, he might have done it, well, then that means he's not guilty in criminal court. So it's totally different.
That's fascinating. And so state schools and private schools are subject to making their own rules, like despite the type of funding they're receiving. So I know state schools are supposed to, if they're receiving federal funding, they're supposed to abide by federal regulation. But do they always?
Schools have been very quick to comply with this federal regulation because they're afraid of their federal funding being yanked. But there are some things that states can do to make sure that everyone who is part of the process has a bit of a fairer time of it. One thing is to make sure that the students have counsel, that they have access to legal representation. Another is to make sure that there is an exchange of evidence before it happens, to make sure that the student knows what he or she has been accused of. So you have all of the necessary disclosure. And so all of those things can make campus hearings more fair.
Excellent, excellent. So do you think private schools who receive no federal funding, and there's only a few of them right now, but do you think they will be able to make the case that they also don't have to abide by constitutional rights?
Yeah. Because they don't take any federal funding, they're not subject to any of the laws that come down from the federal government tied to that funding. And of course, they're totally private institutions. So they are, in fact, it's illegal for them to have a separate system on campus than there would be in a criminal court. Because of course, the punishment isn't that you go to jail, it's that you get expelled. And so it is a private system. And so they are free to do that legally. However, I would say that knowing what I know about the institutions that don't take any federal money, I mean, some of the reasons that they do that are because they respect the kind of rights that I'm advocating for right now. And so I will be surprised if, say Hillsdale and Grove City don't want to give their students free speech rights and freedom of association and due process, because they realize that the rights that are in the Bill of Rights help to create a free society and also help to kind of nurture the kind of talent and the kind of citizenship that they're interested in.
I agree. I totally and completely agree. I think those institutions would be interested in creating the type of student that those regulations aren't protecting right now. So moving on to this free speech issue, which was an NSDA resolution last year, right, that colleges should increase free speech on campuses. So what are the situations in which it would be a good idea to limit free speech on campus?
I think that there are a couple of regulations on free speech that we should expect to see on college campuses, and those are the same regulations on free speech that we see in the more general population. Obviously, if something is a clear and present danger, a direct incitement to violence, none of that is appropriate on a college campus, and it's not appropriate anywhere. But college campuses can also impose reasonable restrictions on the time and place of, say, a demonstration or any kind of speech, really, because obviously within a professor's classroom, he or she has to maintain order. He or she has to run the class as they see fit. And, part of that means that the students can't all stand up and start chanting slogans about, political candidates or what have you, because it's a disruption to class and it means that students can't learn. So, in that learning environment, or say below the windows of a class taking a test, restricting speech in the classroom or right outside of the classroom or during quiet hours, all of that is totally reasonable. A campus is meant to be a place of learning. So, there are a lot of reasonable restrictions you can make to ensure that students learn. But the problem we've seen is that the restrictions go far, far beyond that.
So, and I know one example we heard last year in the NSDA debate resolution was, well, what if you have a white supremacy group and technically they have like the freedom to meet, but they're extremely offensive to other groups on campus and they make their acceptance feel threatened. Is that a legitimate argument? What do you think about that issue of free speech?
That's hard, but that's why the First Amendment was created. It was created to protect really unpopular speech. It was made to protect the speech that we hate. We don't need protections for speech that we love. We don't need protections for people getting together in the quad and singing Kumbaya. We need protections so that the people who say things with which we disagree, even vehemently, are allowed to say their piece. And to the college students who feel unsafe and to all of the people who support them because the Klan is hateful, I would say to them, create a counter protest, create a counter event. There are going to be far more people at your counter event than there would be at any Klan rally. The answer to speech is more speech. You go and you explain to the members of the Klan why being racist is wrong and disgusting.
Right. Very simple solution. So the speech codes that many campuses have put in place, can you explain for our students, what is a speech code? What do they do? And what types of speech do they limit?
Right. So some speech codes are about where you can speak. And those are some of the most egregious. We've seen examples where there is a free speech zone on campus. And so that's the only place where you have free speech. And, colleges will do crazy things. I know one example here in North Carolina. It isn't the case anymore because they fixed it. But there was one university that had their free speech zone, like near the highway by the bus stop, where no students gathered, where no one was going to hear them. And so in that case, the only place on campus you could, for example, pass out a copy of the Constitution was in this zone by the bus stop. And so that really wasn't giving students any kind of meaningful free speech. Other free speech regulations that we see on campus that are problematic are things in the student code of conduct that are meant to make sure that nobody is ever offended. But it gets to be so ridiculous that students can't tell jokes. They can't ask each other out on a date. They can't have any opinions that anyone else might disagree with. And, when it gets to that point, the enforcement becomes really arbitrary because administrators are clearly not policing every joke on campus, but they can use their power to punish the students that they don't like or that they don't agree with. And the group that has done really great work on cataloging all of this is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Fantastic. And on that note, are there any other resources that students should pursue when they're studying this topic? Any of your favorites?
Absolutely. So the Alliance Defending Freedom has gotten really into the religious liberty issues on campus and some free speech issues on campus. So I would say that's a good resource. The American Council of Trustees and Alumni has done great work about what trustees can do to improve their campuses, and also has done a good job showing the decline in academic quality in general education across the country. And so that's another great group to look into. And I think the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, and the Heritage Foundation have also done good work at the federal level about what should be changed, particularly in student loan policy.
So, and let's actually talk about the value of an education now, shifting gears a little bit. So in a lot of our research so far, we keep seeing this analogy thrown around that 60, 70 years ago, a high school diploma helped you get a job. And now a bachelor's degree is the equivalent of that high school diploma 70 years ago. And now a master's degree or MBA, something like that, MBS, they are equivalent to a 4-year degree 10 years ago. Is that true? Have you seen that be true in your examples?
It's certainly true that the expectations of what kind of work or what kind of degree is required for a particular kind of work has changed over the years. And we cataloged it a couple of years ago. What jobs now require a degree that didn't used to? And I think the craziest one we were able to find is that to work at Enterprise Rent-A-Car at any level, they required a bachelor's degree. And that simply wasn't true, 20 years ago. And there are a lot of jobs that you would think that anyone who is reasonably bright and, can listen to instructions and can learn on the job could do that kind of job. But, what groups like Enterprise have figured out is that it's just easier to hire, it's easier to find people if you put a very simple metric on your resume or on your job requirements, because almost everybody who is bright now does go to college. And so it costs them nothing to require a college degree, and it makes their recruiting just a little bit easier. And so for them, it's really a costless way to just make their human resources job easier. What I'm not as clear on is, what are the learning outcomes? How do the learning outcomes compare to 70 years ago? And, sometimes people will dig up data from, Harvard entrance exams or high school exams from 70 years ago and show how very different it was and how much more quality content that students learned many years ago. But I think it's hard to make those black and white comparisons, simply because we don't have great data going back 70 years. I think the really good data starts in about 1965.
And so one thing that I know a lot of students are doing is seeking alternatives to traditional education. In our research, we've seen this in like two main areas: of kids who are looking at community college and then going to another college, or a trade school, since trade jobs are kind of looked down upon, even though some plumbers make more money than some lawyers. So that's our metric for success, right? And then the other sector of people exploring alternatives is kind of like the Lou Merritt, College Plus, that sort of area. So can you explain those and how the federal government should be promoting them or should not be promoting them, or how they could get involved?
Right. So I think the easiest thing for federal and state governments to do to make all of these alternatives easier is to scale back what they require for accreditation and to scale back their regulations, because regulations just make everything more expensive to do. Vanderbilt a couple of years ago said that it cost each student about $11,000 more to attend each year because of all of the compliance that Vanderbilt had to do. Now, there was some pushback and people said 11,000 can't possibly be right. But another study came out and said, well, maybe it's more like 7,000. That's still a lot per student per year, just because the federal government has a bunch of hoops to jump through. And so scaling back regulation, making it easier to be accredited, making accreditation more meaningful instead of just a bunch of kind of paper pushing, would be better for all different types of educational options to thrive. But I think right now what we're seeing is there are some thriving options. They don't take any federal money. They're not trying to give a credential. They're trying to make sure that, students get into jobs as quickly as possible. Some of them are apprenticeship programs. Some of them are code academies. Some of them are just, totally off the wall ways for students to kind of prove themselves by building portfolios or doing art projects, doing things that are completely antithetical to the idea that you have to kind of like punch a certain number of requirements to be prepared. And so I think that, we are seeing a lot of innovation, and it'll just take time before employers realize that not everyone needs a bachelor's degree and that there are better ways to screen for workforce talent.
One of the most interesting things that we have found is that you have so most of employers right now are the baby boomers, right? And so you constantly hear like baby boomers saying that millennials' education and the quality of it is far more diluted than quality of education before, which is true. And we'll talk in a minute about how to increase quality of education, if that's even possible, without, hiring entirely new personnel that we hand select. But one of the most interesting things is that there are certain fields which now employers are realizing maybe we don't need a degree. Wait, for example, I have a friend, he's 24. He is still in school at a community college, and literally he's a programmer. And the whole programming field is oftentimes you're able to get a certification that means as much or more than a degree, and it showcases the same amount of skill. And in the programming/IT field, you are often able to get a job and get a job offer in your lap without even applying for it sometimes, because people need people in that field. Employers are looking and they realize that there is a showcase of skills that don't need a degree. So are there any other fields like that? I mean, I know the tech industry is really easy to exemplify your skills.
Right.
Or maybe not easy, excuse me, but it's easier to showcase your skills instead of, just research ability. So any other fields like that?
The thing that comes to my mind immediately is writing, because we often hire writers at the Martin Center. And what I want more than anything is not a resume. It's give me your writing samples. And, when we hire, we say, bachelor's degree is preferred, because most people who have gone through and gotten their bachelor's degree, it's, they've gotten it for a reason. They've got the perseverance and all of those other things that are necessary to kind of slog through that 4 years of class. But we say more than anything, we want writing samples and lots of them so we can see what a person, has written, has done in the past. We can actually look at their skills. Do you know how to use grammar? Do you know how to put together an article that is interesting? Can you get to the point and show people why something is important in your writing? And those aren't things that you're going to be able to express on a resume. That's something that you prove by doing. And I think that there are probably a lot of other places where that is true. And, you mentioned IT, but I think that, anything having to do with the internet, it's going to be the case. If I want someone to build me a website, I want to see the websites you've built. If I want to hire a photographer who's going to come and do, all of the headshots for our company or create great graphics, then, I want to see the work someone's done in the past and show me a portfolio. And that's so much easier now that we can digitize information. And so I think you're right. All these employers are baby boomers, but that's not going to be true much longer. A lot of baby boomers are retiring. And so I think that people are going to be more open to asking for someone's portfolio instead of asking for a degree.
We've seen so many studies that say a portfolio along with a resume is something ridiculous, like 200% more effective than just a resume. I don't know the exact stats, but you're so right. You're absolutely right. And I think if students explored that sector of career building, that they will see far greater success. So, and moving into kind of like the last segment of questioning, I guess, interrogation, however you feel right now. So how do you think we can increase the quality of education? Because for me personally, selecting a school, I kind of had to go a non-traditional route. I didn't go to a state school. I went to a small university that had retired from maybe higher up schools like Harvard or Yale. And now they moved back home to this tiny town of South Carolina. They're willing to, pour into students. And that has far and away increased the quality of my education. But I haven't seen that at other schools, and I'm not sure why. So can you explore that for us a little bit?
Yeah, I think one of the problems that we see in most institutions is that professors are rewarded for work that has nothing to do with students and nothing to do with teaching. Actually, they're rewarded based on their research instead of based on how well they can communicate in a classroom. And it's incredibly lopsided. It's not just they're rewarded like halfway for their research. Tenure is almost, 80, 90% based on research. And so someone can be a very poor educator and a great researcher and still get tenure. And so that's incredibly problematic. If professors were rewarded for what they do in the classroom and valued for their ability to really communicate with students, to give students the passion for learning or just cultivate the passion for learning that's there, then I think we would see something very different. Another problem is that the requirements have been incredibly watered down. So there are a lot of schools today where you can get through your general education requirements without taking a meaningful course that will help you become a better writer, for example, or a meaningful course that will help you understand kind of civilization. You can put together, a smorgasbord of general education credits that don't build to anything. And something that I strongly believe about general education is that it should be, sequential, and that should all fit together as part of a whole. We had for many years, students would study great works of the Western canon to put together a general education that's meaningful. They would learn the scientific method. They would learn logic. They would learn, communication and rhetoric. And we've lost sight of a lot of that. And so now students, when they're putting together their general education curriculum, they're just picking things that look fun and easy. And, that doesn't really help students in the end.
And what we found in our research is that even if schools are aiming for a more Greek education model, that more classical education, liberal arts, their gen ed credits, for example, they might require you to take a speech class, but that doesn't at all, it's still a very technical class instead of exploring and actually asking students to engage in a realm of ideas. They are asking them to engage in a trade. And it doesn't even matter if it's a more idea or communication or theory based class. It is still extremely technical. So let's back up and rewind just a little bit, because something you said really caught my attention. So professors are definitely rewarded for research and for their contribution to society, and not necessarily their class and their school. So that is problematic. How do we measure a professor's ability to be a good educator? Because I know schools give surveys, but students don't answer surveys unless they had an exceptionally good or bad experience. So it's going to be extremely difficult to obtain that data. How do we measure that?
Well, I think first, I think a lot of the problem just comes from what we're signaling to academics. We're telling them teaching doesn't matter. That's what the entire tenure process is, that's the signal it's sending to teachers or professors. It's telling them, don't worry about it. Don't worry about your performance in the classroom. And so I think that the culture has to change, and that's very hard. You can't legislate culture change, and that's a problem. But I think that universities could make it clear that teaching is important. First and foremost, by requiring people to spend more time teaching than they do research. This is especially true at universities that aren't kind of a research one university. Obviously, a lot of our universities are big research institutions, but a lot of bachelor's institutions have kind of copied those research institutions, saying, well, if it works for Harvard, it ought to work everywhere. And, that's just kind of silly on its face. Obviously, there are a lot of different models that can work. And if you want to focus on something and do something different than the way Harvard does it, that's A-okay. And so I think that by pulling back from research and just saying, your time in the classroom is valuable. We want to see, as part of your portfolio of work, we want to see more time spent on students and on teaching. And so simply by requiring more teaching, I think you're letting professors know that teaching is important. As to how to measure it, I agree with you that the measurements, especially student evaluations, are problematic. I've been on both ends of that as a teacher and as a student, obviously. And you're absolutely right. You don't fill it out unless you've had an experience that's really sticking with you. And, when you're filling in the bubble sheets, you're like, it's the end of class. You really don't care anymore. And so it's just not something that is going to give really meaningful feedback to institutions. But, we grapple with that, though, in every profession, trying to measure what works. And I think that the people on the ground are the best way to figure that out. The people who have, dedicated their lives to it. And, there are a lot of great professors out there, and the administration, they know which ones they are. It's not a secret. And I think those people can be very helpful, and our universities themselves can figure it out if they decide it's important.
I understand what you're saying there, and especially colleges sometimes are having to force students to give them feedback, to give them data to evaluate. For example, I had a professor who offered to give us 5 extra points on our final exam if we would go online and fill out our evaluation, right? So everyone in the class had to do it. So if you want that extra 5 points, if you have a C in the class and you really need to do well in the final, you're just going to say whatever. That's not accurate feedback. That's bribery. So It is definitely difficult to obtain that data. So, and one thing that we've noticed is schools are kind of embracing that research model with professors, because now you have classes that are not just research based. Those are fine, probably. But you have professors who can allow students to structure their own class by joining them in their research. For example, you have a student or a professor who's researching diseases in the 19th century. And you can offer like extra credit for students who want to join you in that research. So is that furthering the problem, or is that a really smart way to accommodate an existing cultural problem?
Well, I think part of it is fine. Learning how to do research is valuable. But if a student spends all of his or her time simply researching a really kind of niche subject, they're going to miss out on a lot of the other things that universities have to offer. And so I think that it's fine as a small side project, and learning how to gather data and to write, which are kind of the most important things that you're doing in research, that's very valuable. But at the same time, there are so many other skills that are necessary and so many other areas of study that a student has to cover, that I think that, simply, if a student did that in every class, that would prepare him or her to be an academic, and that's it. And obviously there aren't enough jobs to go around that we can just prepare, every university student to join academia. That won't work.
So I'm guessing you're a fan of classical or liberal arts education.
I am. I think that getting a kind of a solid base, a solid foundation to build other skills on, it will serve students best. I mean, we know that students and graduates today aren't going to stay at the same job their whole lives. So we don't want to focus on a really, really narrow set of skills. We want something that's going to be flexible and adaptable. And I think having a liberal arts education is the best way to do that. And, there's a reason we have, like 2 years of liberal arts and then a major stacked on top. It's kind of like a pyramid. You start at the base, you get that foundation, you narrow in on something you want to do, and you get a great start in a field, but not necessarily in a particular job. And I think if we adhered to that model and took it seriously, it could still be a good model.
That's a word, flexible or adaptable, that we continue hearing when it comes to liberal arts education. Obviously, I'm receiving one, so I am a fan of them as well. But what we've seen is that there are two main schools of thought on that. So you still have the existing baby boomers who say, no, liberal arts, always bad. You need to be training for a specific trade. Sure, all those skills are useful, but you should just be developing in those skills as a person, not necessarily educationally. So we see that, and that's obviously just going to cycle through like it always does with populations. And then you have our generation, your generation, that is more concerned with having those skills because flexibility and adaptability is becoming an increased value. So I don't know how to tell students to market that, because you have such a split and divided demographic. How do students market their liberal arts education?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think that the two things have to be at odds. As I said, you can get a really strong general education in your first 2 years and then go on to, say, get an applied chemistry major. And so you can do both. But if someone wants to, say, do a philosophy major, then that's a place where you can put together a portfolio and explain what you can do. You can explain that philosophy is problem solving. That's something that employers always say current graduates are not doing a good enough job on. And so if you can explain to them that your philosophy degree prepares you for creative thinking, problem solving, and you can show them that you can write and analyze things that you've written, then those are going to be skills that an employer wants. Do they care that you know the difference between Plato and Socrates? No. But they are going to care about the things that you learned while you were studying philosophy.
It's so interesting. Our company model really focuses on applying that philosophy, obviously, because Plato and Socrates are directly applicable to communication, our line of work. And so it is really interesting to see how that plays into practical application. And wasn't there a study that just came out recently in the past few years that said philosophy is like the most marketable liberal arts degree now, surprisingly, even though it's the one that gets the most hate?
You know, if that came out, I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't remember it offhand.
I think it's just something my college really wants me to believe. So, all right. Well, Jenna, do you have any final thoughts for students this year who are going to be debating this topic, or anything that you think should be kept in the forefront of this debate?
I think it's a great topic. It's so ripe for reform because there are so many problems that I think that students who are debating this topic are going to be able to find really fruitful cases to make. And, I'd love to see what comes of it.
Definitely. All right. Well, we hope to see you judging some tournaments and offering your expertise, because I'm sure people could really learn from it. So thank you so much for your time. And this will be posted on our website tomorrow, and I will send you the link.
I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenna. Have a great one.
Bye.
Bye.